This is the easier-to-read version of 1984 by George Orwell, retold and narrated by Sarah Simpson. Part 1, Chapter 2. Winston was already opening the door when he remembered that he had left his diary sitting out on the table. It was open to the page that read, "Down with Big Brother." He was relieved when it wasn't the thought police. It was only his neighbor, Mrs. Parsons. Mrs. Parsons was only 30 years old, but like Winston, she looked much older. She, like Winston, had lived a very hard life. "Comrade, would you mind trying to fix the kitchen sink for me?" Mrs. Parsons asked. "It's clogged again, and Mr. Parsons isn't home." "Of course," Winston said with relief, following her down the hall. Like most of the buildings in Oceania, Victory Mansions was falling apart, especially the plumbing. You could file a work ticket with the government and they would come to fix things, but that could take months. In the meantime, you'd have no working sink. Most people just fix things themselves rather than waiting. The Parsons apartment was a little bigger than Winston's. Everything in it looked worn out. There were pieces of sporting equipment lying all over the floor. Hockey sticks, boxing gloves, footballs, pairs of sweaty shorts. There were Youth League and Spy League posters all over the walls, as well as a huge picture of Big Brother. The whole place smelled like sweat. "Sorry," Mrs. Parsons apologized, waving her hand around the room. "The kids have been home all day today and they make such a mess." Winston went over to the kitchen sink. It was filled with slimy, stinky, green water. He bent down to look under the sink at the pipe. He hated having to bend over. It always made him start coughing. Mrs. Parsons watched him. "If Tom were here, he would have fixed it. He's good at fixing things," she said. Tom Parsons worked with Winston at the Ministry of Truth. He was a fattish man of paralyzing stupidity, a mass of imbecile enthusiasms. Tom Parsons truly believed that Big Brother was good and that the thought police were doing good, important work. Tom Parsons was the perfect party member. He liked sports, believed everything the government told him without question, and would do anything they told him without hesitation. Winston was trying to fix the sink. There was a broken part keeping it from draining. Mrs. Parsons' children were loud. They stomped and yelled all over the apartment. Winston's headache was coming back. The little boy was 9 years old. The little girl was 7. Both of them were wearing blue shorts, gray shirts, and red bandanas. It was the same uniform all the children who belonged to the Young Spies group wore. The children were playing, pretending to be members of the adult spies. The government made sure that children were given toy guns to play with as soon as they could walk. It ensured they would be ready to use real guns without thinking twice when they grew up. The boy pointed the gun at Winston's face, startling him. So vicious was the boy's demeanor that it was not altogether a game. "You're a traitor," the boy screamed into Winston's face. "You're a thought criminal," yelled the girl. Winston thought the children's game was frightening. These children seemed dangerous, like tiger cubs, which will soon grow up into man-eaters. Winston saw the calculated ferocity in the boy's eyes. The boy wanted to hurt Winston and was nearly big enough to be able to do it. In less than 7 years, he would be old enough to work for the patrol. It was a terrifying thought. Mrs. Parsons noticed Winston's discomfort with the children. "I'm so sorry," she said. "They're upset because I didn't have time to take them to the hanging today. I'm too busy and their dad won't be home until later." This reminded the children they were missing a fun event, and their anger grew larger. "Why can't we go to the hanging?" the boy shouted at his mother. "I want to see the hanging! I want to see the hanging!" the little girl sang, skipping around the apartment gleefully. Winston had forgotten that some Eurasian prisoners were going to be hanged in the park today. It was a common event that happened about once a month. Children loved to watch the hangings. Winston finished the sink and left. After his back was turned, he felt something hit him hard in the back of the head. It really hurt. He turned around and saw the boy holding a slingshot. The boy had shot a rock at his head and was laughing about it. Mrs. Parsons just stood there. She was too scared of her own son to punish him, even when he did something bad. A lot of children would turn in their parents to the thought police if they tried to punish them, and they were never seen again. Back in his apartment, Winston sat down at the table. The voices on the TV were even more annoying to him now that his headache was worse. He thought about Mrs. Parsons, that poor woman. He was glad he didn't have any children. Nearly all children nowadays were horrible. They had bad manners, they liked to hurt people for fun, they talked back to their parents, they did whatever they wanted and the parents couldn't do anything about it. The children knew that all they had to do was tell the thought police that their parents had said something bad about Big Brother, and their parents would be gone. They'd get new parents who would let them do anything they wanted. The parents knew this too, so they were careful never to upset their children. As a result, children today were wild and cruel. They didn't have any concept of right or wrong. Winston was having a hard time figuring out what to write. He started to think about the interaction he had with O'Brien during the 2 Minutes Hate earlier that day. The look they shared reminded Winston of a dream he'd had several years ago. In the dream, he was walking through a room. The room was so dark he couldn't see anything. He passed a person. The person said, "We shall meet in the place where there is no darkness." At the time, the dream hadn't meant anything to Winston. However, as time went on, the dream and the words the person said in the dream started to seem more important. He thought now that the voice in the dream sounded a lot like O'Brien's voice. He thought maybe he'd had the dream right around the time when he met O'Brien for the first time. Was O'Brien the person who spoke to him in the darkness? The sound of a trumpet blared from the TV, a special announcement. Winston stopped and listened. "Attention! There is news from the Malabar War. Our enemy has won a major battle. That means that the war may be over at some point." There's going to be bad news, Winston thought. He was right. The news showed pictures of bloody dead bodies and bombed buildings. Then the announcer said that everyone in Oceania would be getting 20 grams of chocolate every week instead of 30. Winston couldn't see how giving people less chocolate, one of the few enjoyable things they had, would help them win the war any faster, but that's what the announcer said. The TV played the national anthem, "Oceania, I give up everything for you." Winston was glad the camera couldn't see him. He didn't feel like standing up and singing the song. The gin he drank earlier was starting to wear off. Winston went over to the window and looked out at the cold, clear day. He could hear bombs going off in the distance. At any time, between 20 and 30 bombs were falling near London. People used to be afraid of the bombs, but they were used to them now. A sign with the word "Ingsoc," short for English Socialism, was flapping in the wind. The government put up signs like that everywhere to remind people how wonderful life in Oceania was now that they were socialists. However, Winston didn't believe that life was wonderful, and it made him feel like he didn't fit in. He wondered if there was anyone else in Oceania who didn't like the government, the rules, or the thought police. He wondered if he was the only person who saw how terrible things were and wanted them to be different. He stared at the huge words on the side of the Ministry of Truth. War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength. The same words were printed on everything in Oceania. Their money, their postage stamps, cigarette wrappers, food labels. You couldn't escape the message. Asleep or awake, working or eating, indoors or out of doors, in the bath or in bed, no escape. Nothing was your own except a few cubic centimeters inside your skull. The Ministry of Truth was so big, and it made Winston feel small when he looked at it. He was just one small person. How could he possibly change anything? How could his words, written in a secret diary, change anything? Any day now a bomb would come and blow everything up. Winston, the diary, and anyone who would have found the diary in the future and read it. He had to be back at work in 10 minutes, but he finally knew what to write. On the page he wrote, "This is a message either for people in the past or for people who will live in the future long after I am gone. This is for people who believe in free thought. This is for people who accept that all of us are individuals. We are not all the same, and this is a good thing. This is written for people who believe in truth, for people who understand that history can't just be rewritten and changed to advance the latest political agenda. For whoever ends up reading this, hello. I am writing during a sad, dark time. Big Brother tells us what to think and what to do. Everyone is expected to be the same. I hope that wherever you are, things are better than they are here." Winston looked at the page. He had done it. He couldn't change his mind. It had already happened and he couldn't go back. He was, for all intents and purposes, already dead for a crime that hadn't been discovered yet. He wrote, "Thought crime is death." It was strange. Knowing he was going to die made Winston want to live for the first time in many years. He wanted to live long enough to write down all of his thoughts and feelings. He hoped that someday someone would read what he had written and know he had existed.